All right, meetings being recorded. Interesting. All right, so uh, welcome. I'm just kind of gonna give a crash course on what I've pretty much spent most of my summer doing, as well as what I'm working on right now. And I'll kind of get to more in detail of what I'm actually doing with this after giving the crash course, because it's kind of hard to explain some of it when you don't know a lot of these things. Um, so, first things first, you got to know the basics of genetic algorithms. Surprisingly, they aren't really that hard, but without the prior knowledge going in, you wouldn't really understand it. Um, And I will assume that the first question that pops into a lot of people's heads, even though you've probably heard the term genetic algorithm thrown around a lot, is what exactly is that? um, so simply put, it is just an algorithm that approximates biological evolution across many generations on a set of objects that we define. Um, that can be done in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of objects that you can find. Pretty much just about anything that you can think of, you can create a genetic algorithm for. I mean, a good example is I was actually before coming to this meeting, I had watched a video about how there is a car company that was using things like genetic algorithms and machine learning to design a supercar. You can do it about all. Uh, as simple or as complicated as you want when it comes to these things. They can do it. It just might take a bit longer to do so. Um, so why would you use genetic algorithm is probably the next question that pops into a lot of people's minds. Well, the big thing is they tend to get used in problems that are just too hard or we just don't know enough about to be able to solve uh, normally. Or in the case of kind of what my research is about, I mean, there's definitely sprinklings of that. It's a very complex issue already, but the other trick is it can also be faster and more accurate than traditional, say, engineering methods. There's a lot of ways that genetic algorithms might be able to find a better answer than you normally would find by just trying to work through and numerically approximate a lot of things. Uh, so, how do you build one? So, first things first, you're going to need to know how to code. And you can code a genetic algorithm in just about any um, coding language as long as you can do random number generation and arrays of some sort. Uh, I would probably even extend that to if a coding algorithm can't do a three-dimensional array or greater, or multi-dimensional arrays at that, probably not a good idea to use genetic algorithm in there, but you could probably find a way around it. Personally, uh, in my group, we've used C++ the most for everything. Just it plays nice with objects and functions. Uh, but I have seen plenty of Python genetic algorithm scripts as well, including somebody else. I think one of the advisors in my group has a genetic algorithm that he wrote in Python for for something else. I don't know exactly what he uses that one for. Um, once you've kind of decided what coding language you're going to use, you want to define what you're going to be trying to optimize. As I stated before, this can be anything simple or complex, though generally if you're starting out, you probably want to be working on something simpler. One of the more common ones, and what I worked on in the summer, is called a paperclip algorithm, where basically you're just trying to, you have a object that you define as a paperclip. We call it that, but not really. It's just a bunch of unit vectors put together, and you're just trying to tell them to make a shape of some sort by some mathematical calculation. And so to use that example, the one I used in the summer, we would have been optimizing the curl in the z-axis. And so you would do, going on to the next part, defining the fitness function. We would define the fitness to be how close to or how high of a curl in the z direction that individual would have had. And again, depending on what you're using, it can really change how you're defining a fitness function. For example, more complicated things, kind of like one of the ones I'm working on now, a lot of the times you end up outsourcing to some other program to be able to test the performance and then assign a fitness score based on its performance. I guess some examples that to kind of, I guess, demonstrate on how that would work. Going back to, like, I guess the car example from before, you could outsource it to some program that simulates like a wind tunnel, and then calculate how much downforce that car was exerting. There's a lot of different ways of defining fitness, and there's no real set way to do so. You just need to define it in such a way that having a higher fitness score would be closer and closer to being an optimized individual, because a lot of what these genetic algorithms run on is the fitness scores. Once you've defined those kind of things, you'll need to define all the constants and variables that you would need, which can range from, I guess in the paperclip thing that I was talking about, just a bunch of angles in 3 dimensions, to the car example where it could be millions of variables that you're trying to all tweak to get you to your answer. But really, a lot of the time, the amount of variables doesn't really have that much of an effect on the performance of a genetic algorithm. There have been plenty of genetic algorithms out there that have been able to do like millions of different variables and get at least good results in like half an hour. So that's more of a, you just need those for the operator to actually work. Then you have to go ahead and start working on what are called the genetic operators, and I'll get into that in some of these later slides, as well as selection methods, which is what I'm going to kind of cover next. So naively, when a lot of people think about genetic algorithms, especially if you've taken biology or of any kind, let's be honest, pretty much any level, you sometimes there's a tendency to think that what you need to do is you just need to take the best individual from each generation, and do things to that individual, and that's how these genetic algorithms make things better. While you can do that, it's actually really unwise to do so, because you're just going to end up having a program that takes forever to reach its end goal. And the problem is when you're just taking an individual that is the best of its generation, sometimes you miss out on the desired variables that may be hidden in the genetics of another object. Going back to the paper clips, maybe there's a bunch of bad angles in one paperclip, so it gets a really bad fitness score. But then it has one really good angle where if it somehow made its way onto another individual, it might make it really strong. You don't necessarily want to just get rid of that. So you kind of just need to define these what are called selection methods to be able to parse through all the individuals in a population and choose which ones are moving on. The two most developed ways that I'm aware of doing this are called the roulette selection and the tournament selection, though there is another one that works similarly to roulette that's called a rank selection that I've heard of, but I don't know enough about that one, for one. And for two, I've very rarely seen it used, so I'm not going to cover that one. But I will talk about the other two. The first one I'll talk about, and probably the one I'm the most familiar with, just because I've been working with it the longest, is a roulette selection. Now, I assume that most of you at least have an idea of what a roulette wheel is. And for anybody that might not, basically you have a wheel and there's a bunch of different slots that some marble or whatever it is can roll into, and that's how you play roulette and stuff. This works in a very similar way, except best way to imagine it is the slots that the marble can fall into are proportional to how well that individual associated with that slot performs. So to be a bit more formal, basically what you do in a roulette algorithm is it reads in all the fitness scores of these individuals, and then based on the total amount of fitness in the generation and the individual's fitness scores, it defines each individual a probability that it will get chosen. And then you will run some random number generation to be able to generate the whatever probability, and then the individual that's associated with that probability then gets picked to get put into whatever function or move on to the next generation in whatever way you're going to do it. It has a lot of good aspects about it, roulette does, because one of the best things about it is it doesn't really give anybody a guarantee to move on. So, like, in a lot of ways, you will never have the worst individual ever move on in a lot of methods, but in roulette, there is a very small chance that the worst individual can move on. And because everybody has some chance of moving on, that helps with the diversity of the algorithm. There's a lot of variation when you use roulette, though it also has a bit of downsides with it too, because sometimes it's too willing to let bad individuals go on to next generations and so on. And that's mostly in a case of after a while you start getting averages that approach the higher fitness scores in a generation, And when they start getting close enough with a roulette algorithm, sometimes the probabilities start to look almost uniform. They never will be quite uniform, but they get close. And when they're that close to being uniform, then it's hard to make sure you're getting good individuals to move on. And that's where something like tournament comes in. Tournament is less straightforward, and it's not really like a tournament and how we think about it, like a sports tournament where there's like a playoff bracket and it's like, oh, there's two individuals and they go and whoever's better goes. Well, it's kind of like that, but not really. So what this will do is it will randomly select some small percentage, usually about 5 to 10%. From what I've seen, an ideal almost looks like about 7%. Don't ask why. I don't know. It just does. And they enter what's called the tournament pool from there. Once they're in the tournament pool, it will just find the highest in scoring individual and return it back into whatever function called the selection method. So, like I said before, this method is a lot better at making sure you're getting good individuals than roulette is. Like I said, with roulette, you kind of have that. There's always the probability that the worst one gets chosen. But in this one, there's no way that the worst one gets chosen. Even if you get, like, say you're in a population of 100 with a 7% tournament pool, you get the 7 worst individuals that you could have gotten in that pool. Well, you're still going to get the best of the worst in that case, which has its upsides. And a lot of the time, especially when the average fitness scores start approaching what the high fitness scores tend to be, this is much better about making sure the best individuals move on than roulette would be in the same circumstance. Now, these selection methods are great and all, and you need them for pretty much everything in a genetic algorithm, but they don't actually do anything without the genetic operators. So these are the meat to the bones that the selection methods are. And they come in 3 varieties: reproduction, crossover, and mutation. Each one of them gets used in every algorithm. You cannot realistically have a good performing genetic algorithm without all 3 of these. It is possible to have ones that rely completely on one of these, except for reproduction, but I'll explain that in just a minute, and get answers, but it will take you a lifetime. And really, the only one that you could possibly use would be mutation on its own. And again, I'll get into exactly why that is. So reproduction is usually the first function that will get called. And a lot of the times it's better referred to as cloning. The reason it's called reproduction is it's just the lingo that arbitrarily came up with at some point, and so it stuck, as far as I can tell. A lot of times I wish it was just called cloning, though, because that's really what it's doing. Really, what's going on is in some generation, between 5 to 10% of the individuals that are getting put into the next generation are done by this method. And the reason why it's slow is that you need things to change. And with cloning, you're not changing anything. This is basically like having the old individual, like say an old lion in some habitat that just happened to live through multiple generations. And usually these ones that are getting moved on, because they're done through the selection methods, they tend to be better performing individuals. This is kind of the way that a genetic algorithm keeps good individuals in the population, because there's always a chance that with the other two operators that they could make individuals worse, if that makes sense. So reproduction will maybe not guarantee, but make it much, much, much more likely that very well-performing individuals stay around throughout populations as a way of kind of keeping around their genetic code. So that's kind of what reproduction is all about. Crossover is the biggest chunk. This is a bit closer to your birds and the bees, as they say. What happens with crossover is you'll get about 75 to 80% of the individuals that you're going to send into the next population by calling selection methods to select parent individuals. Those two parents then get quote unquote crossed over, where some of their genetic locations, or some of the, I guess, better way of putting it in the coding language of it, some of the numerical values in parts of arrays for an individual gets swapped with another one between the two parents. And this creates two children that then get put into the next generation. The idea here is that you could get two parent individuals that possibly have a few really good traits, but if they had, like, say, we have three operators, or not operators, variables in each parent, and one of the parents has two really good operators, the other one has one, but it just so happens if you get lucky, you get one child with all three of them, and then the other one has the rest of the genetic material retained, because it still might be good for another individual. So this ends up being the biggest part, because this is usually where the big gains come from. This is usually where you get the sudden jumps in fitness score between generations. And then finally, and honestly probably most important, though it plays a smaller role, is the mutation. Mutation functions, there's a few different ways that you can run them in reality. But the main one that I've been using recently is it just randomly generates new individuals that fill up the new population, with the goal of they bring in new variables that the other two genetic operators are able to experiment with. Because if you just have a code with just reproduction and crossover, well, you can get as good as the initial population's genetic code would allow you to get. And so, yeah, there is some optimization involved if you just have those two functions. But to get past those points, sometimes you need new genetic material, and that's mutation's job. And so the way that's the most common is just generating random individuals going in. Though there are plenty of genetic algorithms that I have seen, and I've worked with one that worked like this, where it will read in the children individuals that we spoke about from crossover, and there will be a probability that a mutation occurs in some of the genes, which is a bit closer to how biological mutation works in some cases. But in terms of doing it on a computer, sometimes it's a bit slower and won't necessarily get you the answers you desire. But now that we've got all those, you really know everything you need to know for these. And now the trick is just, well, putting them in order. So how a genetic algorithm runs is that it'll generate a randomly done initial population. This can be of any size for whatever many variables you want. And then it'll go through whatever procedure you defined earlier to develop its fitness score. Once all the individuals have a fitness score, you run through all the genetic operators and selection methods to generate the next population. And you just repeat and repeat and repeat until eventually you get something that looks all right, well, at least as far as you can tell. The real trick is a lot of the times you don't know how long it's going to take to do these, because a lot of the problems that genetic algorithms are used for, we don't know what the optimal score looks like in a lot of cases. But in some cases that you're about to see, we can. So I mentioned before that one of the ones that I worked over on this summer was called a paperclip algorithm that we defined to have a fitness score that was based around its curl in the z-axis. Based on how we defined that, we actually did know a defined fitness score that it would be the maximum. And so what I will show you next is kind of an example of what some of these look like when they're getting run. So this is an example of a bunch of different runs using the same parameters of a genetic algorithm test on these paper clips that was using purely roulette selection methods. You can see how they kind of all originate at about the same point here. The dotted lines are the average, by the way, and these are the high scores. Really, most of the time you care the most about the high score, because you will just basically, once you get an optimized object or solution, you just take the best one and make a bunch of them. But for the case of this research, we wanted to know the complete data in these graphs.
What
and so
colors represent?
Say that again.
Different colors.
Oh, the different colors represent a different run. In total, there are 10 runs being represented here. They are all of the same parameters, though. And that kind of goes to show there's a pretty big variety in these. Genetic algorithms are not foolproof by any means. They're inherently based on random sequences of numbers, or as close to random that your computer will let you. And so what ends up happening is, well, some runs, like this red line run here, will do fairly well, and then other ones like this yellow run here will just be utter garbage by comparison. Some things to note here, though. Like I said before, this is a roulette style selection method. You can see exactly, even in the best run, how jagged some of these things go. And a lot of the times you'll see these dip downs. That's usually happens when the selection method chooses a bad individual. And that's why you kind of get those dips down in generations, because it might not keep around the best individual. And another thing to note is with these particular algorithms, we knew ahead of time what the maximum fitness score was going to be, and that's 9. These ones are not getting to 8, which I'll get into why this matters in just a minute. This, by comparison, is more what a tournament style ends up looking like a lot of time. You can see it ends up getting, at least in this one run, much closer to your ideal fitness score. I believe, if I remember the exact number for this run at the end, was like an 8.99 something fitness score individual at the end of that. But obviously, even in a run that has that kind of height to it, there's still runs that won't even get to the 7 mark. Again, that's just a lot of the time because of the random nature of a lot of this. And you can still see in the early runs some of that jaggedness, those peaks that suddenly drop off when individuals that were pretty good ended up getting released from a generation. But that just happens, and you kind of have to let it happen. Now, of course, you don't also have to exclusively use one selection method too, which is why a lot of the times this is a mix of roulette and tournament selections. I believe this one would be, there would be 3 individuals selected for roulette, and 7 selected by tournament each time. Or I guess in this case, 30% and 70% respectively. And you can see that these ones kind of display characteristics of both of those kind of equations, where you got a bit of that jaggedness all the way throughout that roulette kind of causes, but you still have that asymptotic logarithmic behavior that the tournament style ones have. And I guess it's just another thing to talk about the graph a little bit. This is all over 100 generations. 10 runs, 100 generations, 100 individuals per generation in this case. All of that to develop this entire one graph took probably under a second to do when I ran it. They are very, very fast for simple algorithms like this. And so even generating up to 1,000 generations would take less than 30 seconds to get answers. But the thing is, you don't necessarily want to have to go to 1,000 generations. And that kind of goes into what I was doing with my research throughout the summer. So formally, I am part of Dr. Connolly's genetics group, whose goal is we're making what are called bicone antennas that get put into ice to detect neutrinos. I think it's alongside the ARA collaboration, but I'd have to double check that. Our goal currently is building a algorithm to design these bicones that perform better than the current antennas that are in the ice. Even as a lot of this is kind of what the whole group was doing over the summer. My job dealt with trying to make things faster, because the big problem with the algorithm as it stands is that, well, it takes freaking forever, because of how it defines its fitness function. These bicones are defined based on what's called their effective volume of detecting these neutrinos. So in order to do that, you have to put them into a simulation that simulates a neutrino storm. Well, in order to put them into a simulation, you have to create the 3D model for them. Those two things combined for a generation of, say, 50, I think, takes about an hour per generation. This is not exactly something you want to have to spend 1,000 generations trying to do. You will be using so much computer time. And I should reference that it takes an hour when using the supercomputer center, not even like your standard PC or laptop kind of things. These take an incredibly long time to do. And so over the summer, what I did was I was trying to go through on that paperclip algorithm, which, as I mentioned just a moment ago, takes about a second to do many, many, many generations. And just try to knock back however many generations we needed to be able to get our optimal score. So, like in the beginning of it, once I ended up rewriting the entire thing, it would take probably about 1,000 generations to really get to a close score. But by the end of things, we were able to get it within about 100 generations, which is much nicer. And then now that I've done that, I'm currently kind of going through the main code and modifying everything to well, a work properly, because actually just about probably 2 weeks ago now, after I took a look at it with our resident expert on genetic algorithms, we realized, oh, this has no reproduction method. And oh, it's 60% of the individuals are being mutated every time we run it. And so you can imagine, based on everything I've been talking about up till this point, the graphs for that one looked less like climbing asymptotically and more straight lines that weren't doing much of anything. And so until actually yesterday, we just finished modifying it. And so we got to test it now to make sure it's working properly. And once that is done, and we know it's actually evolving instead of just stagnating like it was before, then the next trick is I'm going to go in and define what's called a pseudo fitness function, which the idea behind that is, like I mentioned before, you can define the fitness function. However, in this case with these bicones, it's their effective volume when going through these simulations that they do. But the trick is, even that effective volume has a bicone with set dimensions that is defined. And what the algorithm is doing is it's trying to find those dimensions. So one of the things that I'm going to try to do is define basically a fake bicone that is our quote unquote optimal solution, that I'm going to try to tell the code, build this bicone based on its dimensions entirely, and try to optimize it based on that, and then test it for like different shapes and sizes of these bicones to figure out how quickly it can do that. Because if it can get to any random bicone very quickly, in theory, it could very, very quickly get to our actual optimal one when we send it through the very, very, very long process. And with that, I think that's all I have. Does anybody have any questions?
Sure. This might be more for the general group, but since you mentioned specific coding languages for uh, doing certain things like how C++ is better at functions, and then yada yada yada. For the entire pantheon of doing, I guess, like actual science, what coding languages are your guys' favorites, or specifically ones that you find more useful, or ones that will be most useful in general? Just yeah.
Uh, Personally, on a strictly which coding language I prefer, I like Python the best. I think Python is the nicest coding language that I have worked with. That being said, uh, for these genetic algorithms, I think C++ plays the nicest with them just because of how they're typically set up. But in reality, uh, a lot of the times, especially if you're working with the outside sources, like in the bicone algorithm I'm working with, you actually need multiple coding languages and slices of code to be able to execute a lot of these things. I think the entire algorithm, the genetic portion of the algorithm uses C++, but then there's also parts that are using bash script to route everything and to move files that the genetic algorithm outputs to into the simulations, and then it reads those things back into Python, which then does data analysis and plotting for all of those. So really, a lot of it's, you got to know what kind of thing you're gonna set out to do and choose your algorithm, your not algorithm, your code based on that.
All right. Thank you.
Mhm. I don't know what anybody, if anybody else has anything to add to that question.
Briefly, and just say that Python's probably used the most. I'm an experimental high energy, and that's almost all that we use. And talking to others, it seems like that's probably the most popular. But
Yeah, and I know in astronomy, Python is heavily used to the point where the class that I'm in is entirely Python based.
Interesting. Thank you.
Any other questions?
so I'm a little curious with this optimization. So you're talking about right? It takes you an hour to run a generation on the OSC. Uh, so when you so presumably then your computing jobs are probably like maybe on the hour of 10 generations or something maybe. And
Yeah, something like
get the
that.
result out of that, and if it's not good enough, can you then put in the output from your first job and put that back in so that you start from a more optimized state, or are you kind of always starting at a rather poorly optimized
Yes.
arrangement?
Okay. So, currently, how that algorithm runs is it has a start state and a continuation state. Everything that gets used in that particular algorithm gets saved into a generation DNA file. And so it'll save at least the last generation that was done. And then you can tell the code to just continue, and it will just read in that all the fitness scores and information from that generation DNA that it needs to be able to do its um, I guess algorithm is the best way of putting it. But if you want to start from ground zero in, I guess, the case that we're about to have, where it's just, we just ended up fixing something, and so now we think the results that we were getting before are just garbage, and so we can just grab we would just start from the beginning from that point, because the other results are essentially garbage. results, and so there's no reason to start with them when we can just generate a new population. But yes, to clearly answer the question, yes, you can start in a more optimized state than instead of just the random state anytime you want to run it.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Any more questions?
So I find myself wondering why you have to go through this complicated process of checking the specific cone shape against the simulation. Like, is certainly there's something, or certainly I would think, and it's entirely possible I'm wrong about this, that there's something in the way the simulation works which would, inherently be able to tell you up front how probabilistically a certain bicone shape is going to fare, and you could just run that as the fitness algorithm rather than going through the very complex process of setting up the simulation, and that would, optimize your fitness algorithm immensely.
Well, okay. I cannot give too much information on exactly how the simulation runs because I do not know all of the physics behind it. But the trick with that simulation is that neutrinos inherently have some randomness to them, to the point where it's like they're very unlikely to get detected in the first place. And what's really being detected, I think, in a lot of these neutrino cases is electromagnetic waves that end up getting sent off when they do have an interaction. And the physics, if I am correct, is just so that we don't have an accurate way of saying when those interactions are going to happen or how they're going to happen. And so the detection of them is kind of unknown to a lot of degrees. And so we do have to kind of run these simulations for each type of bicone. Now, in the case where in the reproduction, where a bicone has already gone through this simulation, you don't need to run it again, which just saves some of the wall time. But anytime you have a new bicone, you got to send it through to just see how it performs, just because just that random nature of how neutrino interactions work.
And is this, when you talk about the simulation, is this the full physics simulation, like the neutrino interacting with, I assume this is this for Anita or is this for Ice Cube, Ice Top?
The simulation is by the ARA organization. It's called ARA Sim.
Okay.
Like I said, I don't know all of the ins and outs of it. I haven't personally worked with that bit of it, the algorithm personally.
Okay.
But I do know for a fact, I do know that I would assume that it uses all of the physics, though there is a light version too, but we don't use that one.
Sure. So I'm kind of curious. So what are you saying, you want to develop genetic algorithms to design better antennas? Is this to improve gain? Or like are you trying to improve energy sensitivity to these to get higher energy resolution, or are you just trying to identify them at all? I guess those are kind of similar things. Like what's being optimized here? Obviously design shape, but to what end?
I know that the fitness score that we have optimized is the effective volume. I assume that has to do with outright detection, but I've also heard things being thrown around at meetings about beam patterns. So I think that one is slightly unclear as far as I know. I don't know exactly what's going on there. I've just been kind of on the development of the algorithm side of things.
Sure. Yeah, I know the feeling.
Any more questions before we are done here? Because if not, I think that's all I have. Thanks for inviting me to do this talk, guys.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Ryan. It's really interesting stuff. Definitely very much on the computational side of things that physicists get up to. I think to a certain extent, Liam, who gave a talk a few weeks ago, for those of you who were there, he and I have been talking a little bit more about this, is really the value of being able to design experiments competently and efficiently in ways that, you know, save money is actually really important to the field, especially right now, but in general is very important because, you know, if you could find a cheaper way to do something, you open up the possibility to probe deeper into other things which are definitely more expensive sides of it. So definitely this is a really important thing that I think oftentimes gets overlooked when we're thinking about experimental or research physics at all, is that experimental design is a huge component of it, not just what you're investigating, but how you investigate it and how you can do that more efficiently. So yeah, it's definitely a very important thing to talk about. Thank you again for speaking, Ryan, and thank you to everyone else for showing up.
Have a good night.
Yep. And good luck on any midterms you might have this week. I realize that you had to take an hour out of your week to come here, and especially at a time that could be quite busy. So I hope it was informative and a lot of fun. And we should see y'all next week. Well, actually, probably this weekend. There will be some information circulating about an event this weekend soon. So keep an eye out for that. Till then, take care.
Have a good evening.